At 06:15 on the morning of August 21, 1942, beneath a hard, tropical light leaking through a ring of coconut palms, Colonel Kiyonao Ichiki stood on the near bank of a shallow, tannin-stained creek and expected the men on the far side to break and run. He had brought 917 soldiers, many veterans of earlier campaigns, convinced that a swift, aggressive attack would scatter the Americans defending the Jungle Ridge and reopen the road to Henderson Field. What Ichiki did not foresee was how thoroughly that conviction, rooted in a lifetime of doctrine, precedent, and cultural assumption, would be shattered by the cold, precise violence waiting on the other bank. That moment, wading into a small creek against a web of pre-registered machine gun fire and coordinated artillery, creates a lens through which we can answer the title question. What did Japanese commanders really think about U.S. Marines, and how did what they thought changed after Guadalcanal? The short answer is that before the island campaign, many senior Japanese officers expected American soldiers to be inferior in spirit and will, a belief confirmed by early Japanese victories. Guadalcanal forced a painful reassessment by exposing the limits of such assumptions. The Marines' training, doctrine, and adaptability turned many Japanese tactical expectations on their head. To understand why that reassessment was so consequential, we have to look at the intellectual and experiential world from which commanders like Ichiki and later Kawaguchi and Hyakutake drew their expectations. Yamato Damashi, Doctrine as Confidence. Japanese professional and popular military thought in the decades before 1942 did not grow in a vacuum. It was shaped by symbolic victories, by cultural notions of fighting spirit, and by an institutional impatience with long wars of attrition. At the center of that worldview was a concept often rendered in Western writing as Yamato Damashi, the Japanese spirit. In military terms, Yamato Damashi was not a mystical quality, but a doctrine. The belief that superior morale, unified will, and offensive elan could, if properly applied, offset or even reverse disparities in equipment, numbers, or logistics. It emphasized decisive, often frontal action, the moral weight of the banzai charge, the idea that moral weakness, cowardice, or lack of will was decisive in the collapse of an enemy. This emphasis was reinforced by historical precedent. Japan's victory over Russia in 1905, its rapid expansion in the late 1930s, and the early months of 1942 across Southeast Asia and the Western Pacific all gave the Imperial General Staff tangible proof that offensive spirit and bold maneuver produced results. The fall of Singapore in February 1942 in particular loomed large. For Japanese officers, it became a potent symbol that Western colonial formations could be outmaneuvered and, crucially, that their troops could be made to collapse under the pressure of aggressive attacks.
The ease with which Japanese forces had routed numerically and by some measures technically superior opponents fed a confirmation bias. If the doctrine had worked again and again, it must be right. Those assumptions extended into assessments of American soldiers. Junior and senior officers alike, influenced by both cultural stereotypes and selective evidence, expected U.S. troops to be less committed fighters, overly reliant on nervous supply lines, and unwilling to accept losses with the same stoic acceptance encouraged in Japanese troops. In the eyes of many imperial commanders, American material advantages, ships, planes, mass production, were offset by a supposed lack of that intangible spirit. It followed, in their logic, that a spirited attack, properly timed and led, could still achieve decisive results, even against numerically superior or heavily armed opponents. But doctrine alone does not make a fighting force. Across the 1930s, the United States Marine Corps was quietly rebuilding and modernizing. The Corps had not been idle. In small, doctrinal increments, it had been preparing for the very kind of amphibious, shore-to-shore fight Japan expected to face. The Marines of 1942 did not arrive on Guadalcanal by accident. They were the product of training that emphasized small unit initiative, combined arms coordination, and a doctrinal discipline that allowed junior leaders to act decisively when contact and confusion forbade long orders. The U.S. emphasis on pre-registered artillery, on interlocking fields of machine gun fire, and on flexible defensive positions would prove fatal to several Japanese assumptions: that the enemy would be immobile, that he could be massed at will, and that a sudden, daring night assault could be repeated with the same success as in Burma or Malaya. Early victories and growing hubris. By mid-1942, Japanese commanders had good reason, on the surface, to be confident. The southern operation had yielded spectacular gains. Malaya fell rapidly in the winter of 1941-42. the Philippines and the Dutch East Indies had been overrun with speed and, in many cases, with less organized resistance than Japanese planners expected. Those conquests did not merely expand territory, they created a narrative of invincibility. When professionals study campaigns, they pay attention to what previous outcomes teach about human behavior. For many in the imperial general staff, the recurring pattern was clear. Aggressive action produced routes. The implicit lesson was that Western colonies, and in some minds the broader industrial powers, would fold in the presence of enough spirit and audacity. That narrative was convenient. It allowed Japanese planners to accept broader strategic risks, the dispersal of forces, the use of night maneuver as a substitute for firepower, the reliance on naval initiative because tactical will was thought to negate those dangers.
When commanders elsewhere or above them needed evidence that their doctrine worked, the stream of early victories provided it. But 2 points are essential to keep in mind. First, the operational environment in the early conquests, large, relatively open terrains in the Asian mainland, under the shadow of broken colonial command, was different from the tangled, small-scale demands of the Solomon Islands. Second, Japanese intelligence and interpretation presupposed a certain universality of human behavior, that what had broken the defenders of Malaya would likewise break defenders on a narrow jungle perimeter on a volcanic island. That leap from previous precedent to new context was the first of Guadalcanal's conceptual failures. The landings and the first shock. When U.S. Marines landed on Guadalcanal and seized a Japanese airfield in early August 1942, the Imperial Command in the region understood the political and operational stakes immediately. Control of the airfield, soon named Henderson Field, would threaten Japanese lines of communication between Rabaul and the Solomons, imperiling convoys and bases. The reaction was not uniform, but it was urgent. Reinforcements were dispatched from nearby garrisons, and among those units was a detachment under Colonel Ichiki. Ichiki's orders, as they reached him, were cautious in intent: conduct a reconnaissance in force, probe the American positions, and, if possible, delay them until larger reinforcements could arrive. What Ichiki believed when he received those orders owed less to the fine print on a dispatch than to his own operational experience and the doctrinal logic that governed his thinking. Reports reaching Japanese officers, sometimes exaggerated or derived from poor coastal reconnaissance, tended to underplay the American strength and to emphasize the supposed inferior will of U.S. troops. The result was a mismatch. Ichiki viewed the mission as an opportunity for a decisive morale-driven blow rather than a holding action. On the night of August 2021, Ichiki moved. He elected to strike with speed and aggression rather than wait, committing the bulk of his 917 men to a frontal, night approach across a shallow watercourse known to the Americans as Alligator Creek and locally identified on Japanese maps as the Tanaru. The plan depended on surprise and on the moral collapse of the defenders once Japanese units achieved contact. It also depended on the assumption that prepared American firepower, machine guns and artillery, would not be as well organized or as deadly in the dark as it proved to be. That assumption would prove catastrophically wrong. The battlefield is not a sterile diagram, it is a sensory, violent place. The Japanese attack moved through tight jungle, under dripping ferns, the air thick with the smells of rot and fuel and the metallic tang of sweat. They crept to the waterline under the cover of a humid night, then surged across toward the faint muzzle flashes of the defenders. But the Marines on the ridge had prepared the approaches, machine gun positions sighted to sweep the shallow creek crossings, and pre-registered artillery zeroed on likely crossing points. When Ichiki's waves struck, they found not a flimsy defensive line, but a coordinated network of fire. Accounts compiled after the action emphasized the blunt materiality of the defeat. Men mowed down in knotted slashes of tracer and steel. Attackers bogged in the mud and then cut down in clusters. The Japanese assault, repeated in waves, could not break the interlocking fire. Within hours, the attack had ceased to be an offensive and had become a rout. The human cost was severe. Of the roughly 917 men Ichiki led across the creek, approximately 800 did not return. The Marines' losses were light in comparison. The defenders reported casualties far lower than the Japanese, and their ability to hold the ridge without reinforcement surprised even their own commanders. How did the Imperial Command interpret this blow? Initially, with disbelief. For many at headquarters, Ichiki's destruction was an execution problem. Their instinct was to look for poor command choices, miscommunication, faulty reconnaissance. It was easier, institutionally,
to allege errors in execution than to confront the possibility that an entire doctrinal premise, one that had been validated by earlier victories, had failed in a specific context. That reaction was not unique to Japanese commanders. Militaries routinely attribute defeats to tactical error before re-examining strategic assumptions. But the stakes were unique in the Pacific. If the problem was more than Ichiki, then the costs of continuing to assume that spirit alone could win wars were far greater than anyone at the time wanted to admit. The humiliation of a defeated detachment had implications beyond the immediate loss of manpower. It challenged the idea that night assaults, executed with moral courage and physical daring, could substitute for careful combined arms preparation. It forced Japanese leaders to reconcile two uncomfortable truths at once: that American defensive systems could be effective under duress, and that the Marines they had faced were not the soft troops their pre-war observers had assumed. A short, sharp reassessment. In the days following Ichiki's annihilation, Japanese signal traffic and staff papers reveal a pattern of constrained explanation. Rather than broadcast doctrinal doubt, several staff officers blamed poor reconnaissance, overconfidence on the part of a single commander, and the misfortune of terrain that favored the defender. Some officers recommended harsher discipline and more thorough preparation for attacks in small-scale terrain. Others, privately or in low-level memos, scribbled the beginnings of a different conclusion. American troops could, in fact, stand and fight in a way that made technical firepower and cohesion decisive.
But institutional change moves slowly, and emotion and honor bind militaries to doctrinal narratives. For many Japanese commanders, the temptation was to treat Ichiki as an aberration rather than the symptom of a broader problem. Across these reactions, there is an important psychological theme: cognitive dissonance. Accepting that American soldiers could be as tenacious and as well coordinated as Japanese doctrine assumed only the Japanese possessed implied that many victories claimed in the first months of the war had been contingent rather than definitive, a dangerous conclusion for a military already stretched thin. The path of least resistance was to keep fighting as before, to reconstitute units, and to look for a replication of success through bolder action. But the Marines did not wait passively to be tested again. The defense of Henderson Field had demonstrated in a small but consequential way a system of combat that combined initiative at the small unit level with centralized fire coordination. Marine junior leaders were trained to make split-second decisions and to call for artillery that had been prearranged to support likely defensive sectors. That combination, the initiative to exploit local conditions and the capacity to bring heavier fires to bear quickly, was a practical answer to the Japanese emphasis on spiritual primacy. It turned the notion of offensive elan against itself by making the defense both resilient and, when necessary, devastatingly effective. A necessary early click of the reel. If you value deep dives into turning points like this one, consider subscribing. The next stages of the campaign would test Japanese assumptions at larger scales. Ichiki's disaster was brutal and instructive, but it was, in the minds of many imperial officers, an episode, a painful one, that could be fixed by better planning, more careful reconnaissance, and the application of veteran troops. That attitude set the table for the next major probe, the operation under Major General Kiyotake Kawaguchi, which would aim to seize subject terrain by moving through the jungle and turning the American perimeter from the flank. Unlike Ichiki's force, Kawaguchi's detachment would be larger and more deliberately task-organized. It would also inherit the same core expectations about the relationship between spirit and victory. What Kawaguchi thought, and what he expected of his men, was not radically different in language from Ichiki's. He too believed in the power of determined assault and in the necessity of offensive action to restore Japanese initiative on Guadalcanal. But the conditions of the approach march, the depth of the jungle, the limitations of supply, the dispersion of small units across a broken track network would test whether doctrinal belief could survive the more mundane realities of movement and coordination.
More importantly, Kawaguchi's plan would confront a Marine force that had already tasted victory and had begun adapting its defensive layout, artillery registration, and small unit leadership to the peculiarities of the island. As Kawaguchi's men made their way toward the ridge that would become the focal point of the next major battle, several operational problems emerged that would compound the tactical difficulties his troops faced. The jungle was not merely an aesthetic inconvenience, it was an enemy in its own right, sapping strength, obscuring lines of sight, and complicating communication. Supply lines for food, ammunition, and medical care were tenuous. The Tokyo Express, the naval effort to rush reinforcements and supplies by destroyer at night, could not always deliver the quantities necessary for sustained defensive operations. Weather and disease were constant drains on morale and effectiveness, and the psychological toll of several nights of forced marches and limited rations is difficult to overstate. Taken together, these factors meant that Kawaguchi's flanking approach was not merely a question of tactics, but of logistics and human endurance. The imperial staff's persistent belief in the decisive power of morale would be tested not only by the Marines' bullets, but by how far soldiers could be pushed through a night march without water, without reliable food, and with the constant expectation of contact. If Ichiki's assault had been a brutal proof that prepared defensive fires could defeat an audacious night attack, Kawaguchi's operation would ask a different question. Could a larger, more professionally led assault overcome the cumulative friction of jungle operations and still achieve the decisive blow the general staff needed? That question was not academic. If Kawaguchi failed, the implications for higher-level Japanese strategy were stark. It would suggest that the theater's operational environment, fragmented islands, poor logistical lines, and an increasingly coordinated Allied response favored attrition rather than the rapid victories Japanese doctrine had promised. Yet the choice Japanese commanders faced was constrained by the broader strategic picture. Rabaul's garrison could not be left idle while the Allies consolidated Henderson Field. The attempt to retake the airfield by ground assault reflected, in part, a calculation that inaction would be worse than risky action. What remains crucial to the arc of perception is that many Japanese leaders embarked on these larger efforts still clinging to earlier assumptions, assuming that American resolve could be broken if the Japanese attacked with enough ferocity and skill. Kawaguchi's approach began under a veil of confidence. He expected to leverage his men's training and fighting spirit to achieve surprise and to shatter the American center.
He expected, as did many Japanese commanders of the moment, that the combination of a bold night approach and close combat would privilege bravery over resource advantages. If that faith had cracks in it, if doubts about logistics and the Marines' capabilities required a more cautious posture, those doubts are not visible in Kawaguchi's initial intent. What he did not anticipate, and what would become increasingly clear as his men approached the ridge, was the degree to which the Marines had learned from Ichiki's fate and prepared to convert small unit initiative into sustained defensive success. The first notes of that confrontation, skirmishes on narrow paths, sporadic clashes near jungle streams, the mounting logistical complaints from men dragging ammunition through mud, would escalate into a greater test for both sides. At stake was not merely a ridge, but the credibility of doctrinal claims held in Tokyo, and the ability of Japanese commanders to reconcile the romantic rhetoric of Yamato Damashi with the practical demands of sustained island-bound warfare. As Kawaguchi's men pushed deeper into the island, the problem was less a single failed assumption than a cascade of small frictions that multiplied into decisive weakness. The approach march to what Marines would call Edson's Ridge began not as a classical night assault across a single creek, but as a complicated series of moves through broken trails, across ridgelines, and into pockets of jungle that refused to be treated as mere terrain on a map. Units slipped, lost contact, and arrived piecemeal. Water and food were rationed, then exhausted. Ammunition bags became burdens to be hoisted on shoulders already raw from long marches. Where Japanese doctrine prized momentum and moral weight, the practical realities of movement in such an environment rewarded steadiness and measured supply. What Kawaguchi expected, an American perimeter shattered by the shock of a sudden flank attack, was undermined by the most mundane of military enemies: distance, exhaustion, and disordered timing. From the Marine perspective, the ridge was a fortuitous concentrator. Henderson Field's defenders had dug in, pre-registered their artillery on likely avenues of approach, and placed machine guns so that, in the darkness, crossing points could be turned into kill zones. Lieutenant Colonel Merritt Red Mike Edson's composite force, part Raiders, part Parachute Battalion, mixed infantry, was small by numbers, but adept by training. What mattered in the jungle was not mass, but the interplay of initiative and the available fires. Marine junior leaders were empowered to exploit gaps, and pre-planned artillery support meant that even in the chaos of night, a call for fire could be brought to bear with deadly precision. The clash that followed in mid-September 1942 was savage, intimate, and decisive. Japanese troops, at times within yards of Marine positions, launched repeated close-quarters attacks. The ridge's defenders repulsed assaults with coordinated small arms and artillery, and when the perimeter buckled, the Marines counterpunched to restore critical sectors. Accounts afterward emphasized the particular mixture that worked against Kawaguchi: the ability of slightly outnumbered defenders to combine small unit leadership, patrols, local counterattacks, ad hoc defensive improvisation, with the heavier weight of supporting fires the Japanese lacked in quantity or timely delivery. Casualty tallies are necessarily imprecise, but the results were plain. Japanese losses in the fight to hold and then retake approaches around Edson's Ridge are commonly estimated at several hundred dead. Conservative tallies put Japanese fatalities at something over 600, while other studies suggest numbers could have been higher when missing and later deaths from wounds are included. Marine casualties were substantially lower, though not insignificant, several dozen killed and a few hundred wounded, the range depending on which after-action account one consults. These numbers mattered less than the operational lesson. A larger force, moving under doctrine that prized aggressive closure, could be broken by a smaller but better supplied and better coordinated defensive organization. The immediate Japanese reaction followed familiar institutional patterns. Kawaguchi's higher headquarters did not immediately abandon the framework that had produced victories across Southeast Asia and the early Pacific. Instead, fault-finding turned inward, to reconnaissance failures, to the difficulties of jungle movement, to local command choices. Some officers began to entertain a more uncomfortable conclusion: American units could stand and fight with a cohesion and tactical competence that transformed previously reliable Japanese operational models into liabilities. But that conclusion was slow to move from private memorandum to public doctrine. Honor-bound officers feared attributing failure to ideological prescriptions like Yamato Damashi, and the wartime demand for optimistic assessments made candid appraisals politically hazardous. Even as Japanese staff debated, the Marines consolidated and adapted. The lessons of Ichiki's defeat and Kawaguchi's setback were not lost on U.S. commanders. Henderson Field's defenders continued to sharpen their procedures, improve communications with ships offshore, and refine how artillery could be used to support likely defensive sectors. In short, the Americans were learning to fight in the island environment, and that learning loop had a tempo the Japanese command structure tended not to match. The October offensive, the largest attempt yet to crush the American perimeter, was in many ways the decisive test of how much Japanese commanders had learned from the earlier defeats and how much they remained captive to older assumptions.
Under Lieutenant General Harukichi Hyakutake, and with veteran formations such as elements of the Sendai Division, Japanese planners put together a multi-directional assault aimed at seizing Henderson Field and collapsing the Marine positions. The scale of the endeavor was significant: more men, more coordination, an attempt to bring together the fractured tactics of earlier plans into a single decisive stroke. Yet the operational picture was still constrained by the same structural limitations: logistics, disease, and the limits of nighttime maritime resupply through the Tokyo Express. What Hyakutake intended, what many in Japanese headquarters hoped, was a return to the kind of operational decisiveness that had produced early 1942 successes. Massed night attacks, close-quarters assault, and disciplined morale would break the perimeter, reopen supply lines, and reassert Japanese control over the Solomons. But Guadalcanal's defenders offered a different calculus: American artillery pre-registration on expected avenues, improved coordination between ground and naval gunfire, and the rise of small unit leaders capable of bold countermeasures transformed the battlefield into a place where straightforward massed infantry attacks were especially vulnerable. Here, too, the narrative requires attention to individuals whose actions would come to symbolize the altered balance. Sergeant John Basilone, a Marine whose Medal of Honor citation would later frame his actions in October as emblematic of tenacity under fire, manned machine gun positions, and coordinated resupply under intense enemy pressure. Basilone's award recognizes how small unit leadership and personal initiative could multiply the defensive capacity of the perimeter, sustaining a line that might otherwise have caved under sheer pressure. Lieutenant Colonel Louis Chesty Puller, already well known for aggressive leadership, played his part in holding vital sectors and restoring threatened positions. Puller's handling of counterattacks, his insistence on aggressive local leadership, and his ability to coordinate with supporting arms helped to blunt Japanese attempts to leverage massed human waves into a breakthrough. These Marine leaders did not negate the numerical pressure. Rather, they multiplied the force of relatively limited material power through disciplined, decentralized action. The October assault, executed over several nights and culminating in particular violent action around October 24-26, inflicted grievous losses on Japanese attacking formations.
Estimates for Japanese casualties in the October offensive vary among sources. Many historians place the figure in the low thousands for that series of attacks. Conservative tallies suggest something on the order of between roughly 2,200 and 3,000 killed, wounded, and missing during the major assaults in late October, while acknowledging that counting the wounded who later died and those lost to disease complicates precise measurement. American casualties were significant, but markedly lower. The defenders absorbed the attacks and retained control of Henderson Field. What interrogation reports and staff papers from the period reveal, again with the caveat that documents must be read in context, was an emerging recognition among Japanese commanders that their models had not fully accounted for the interplay of material support, decentralized initiative, and the sheer adaptability of the American units they faced. Still, the response at the operational level was not a wholesale doctrinal conversion. In the immediate aftermath, many Japanese officers continued to emphasize courage and offensive spirit as the primary solution, proposing ever larger assaults rather than a profound restructuring of supply, transport, and combined arms logistics. That stubbornness would exact a strategic price. To understand why Guadalcanal produced such a painful cognitive shift, the logistics story must be foregrounded. Japan's operational model across the Solomons relied heavily on naval mobility, fast destroyers running at night to deliver troops, light supplies, and occasional artillery pieces. The Tokyo Express solved one problem, moving men quickly where large transports might be interdicted, but it created others. Destroyers could carry only limited cargo, could not transport heavy equipment effectively, and risked being drawn into costly surface actions. Even when the Tokyo Express delivered troops, those forces often arrive without the sustained rations, medical supplies, or heavy ordnance necessary for prolonged offensive operations. Disease multiplied the logistics problem. Malaria, dysentery, and other tropical illnesses sapped combat power at prodigious rates. Japanese records and post-battle medical reports make clear that sickness reduced effective strength consistently. Some units operated at strikingly low percentages of nominal complement. Supply shortages exacerbated morale issues. Troops denied steady sustenance and proper medical care were not the same troops that had stormed through Malaya or the Philippines. The cumulative effect of supply limitations and disease turned doctrinal confidence into a brittle asset. Japanese command culture amplified these problems. Institutional incentives favored aggressive reporting and optimistic assessments. Admitting the depth of problems, logistical shortfalls, the tenacity of enemy defense, or doctrinal mismatch risked official censure or the stigma of defeatism.
These cultural factors complicated candid appraisals and delayed the operational reforms Guadalcanal demanded. In contrast, the Marine Corps' organizational culture, born of interwar reforms that emphasized amphibious doctrine, junior leader initiative, and coordinated fires, enabled faster adaptation on the ground. The Marines did not have inexhaustible supplies, but their doctrine allowed them to make the most of what they had, and their leadership structure allowed for rapid, decentralized decision-making under pressure. The psychological effect on Japanese commanders was gradual but profound. Initial disbelief, blame directed at execution rather than doctrine, gave way to a dawning recognition that the enemy could not be dismissed as merely lacking guts. Interrogations after later battles and post-war memoirs reveal an increasing respect for American industrial staying power and for the tactical competence of U.S. troops. Where Yamato Damashi had once been invoked as a near-automatic trump card, commanders now acknowledge that material sustainment, air superiority, and the ability to bring coordinated fires to bear were decisive factors in modern warfare. Guadalcanal was not the sole cause of that conversion of thought, but it was a dramatic, timely, and costly demonstration that the earlier model was insufficient in the face of a protracted attritional conflict. Strategically, this shift had consequences beyond the island's beaches. Once Japanese commanders recognized that defeating American forces required not merely daring, but reliable logistics, sustained air cover, and secure lines of supply, the space for the kind of fast decision-making that had brought early successes narrowed. Resources that might have been massed elsewhere were siphoned off to meet the new reality. More importantly, the Japanese high command began to confront a grim arithmetic. Japan lacked the industrial base to replace men and material at the rate the United States could. The transformation in perception made attrition a more visible danger and underscored the need for better strategic prioritization, an area where Japan's choices were, by mid-1943, increasingly constrained. Yet it is essential to avoid overly deterministic claims. Guadalcanal did not alone shatter Japanese capacity or immediately produce strategic realignment at the highest levels. Some commanders continued to argue for offensive risk as the best means to regain the initiative. But the island's cumulative lessons around intelligence failure at Ichiki's attack, the limits of flanking approaches in Kawaguchi's march, and the devastating attrition of the October assaults converged into a more sober attitude among many Japanese officers. They came to understand, sometimes reluctantly and often too late, that the enemy they faced on small Pacific islands was neither a colonial formation likely to crumble under a spirited assault, nor a mirror of easily routable forces they had bested elsewhere.
The Marines, in particular, had proved capable of leveraging limited resources into tenacious, interlocking defense through doctrine, training, and initiative. The human cost of that doctrinal collision remains the most sobering part of the story. Close combat on Guadalcanal produced scenes of extraordinary suffering. Men on both sides killed in dense jungle, wounds untreated in the humid heat, and daily life eroded by hunger, mosquitoes, and exhaustion. When historians count dead and wounded, they do not merely tally numbers. They trace the erosion of institutional capacity and the personal devastation left in a campaign's wake. On the Japanese side, specific battles are often given conservative ranges. Roughly 800 of Ichiki's 917 killed at Tenaru/Alligator Creek, several hundred to over 600 dead in the Kawaguchi action around Edson's Ridge, and in the October offensive, estimates varying but commonly cited between roughly 2,200 and 3,000 casualties in the major assaults, numbers that include killed, wounded, and missing, and that do not capture later deaths from wounds or disease. Marine casualties were lower in these engagements, but they were nonetheless severe enough to leave a deep imprint on units and families back home. The legacy of Guadalcanal for Japanese command thinking thus operates on two levels. Tactically and operationally, commanders who had expected morale and courage to substitute for material superiority were forced to incorporate the realities of combined arms fires, logistics, and decentralized initiative into their mental maps. Institutionally, Guadalcanal contributed to a growing realism about the war's strategic logic. Prolonged attrition favored the industrially stronger adversary, and island-by-island contests might squeeze Japanese resources to the point of strategic overreach. In subsequent campaigns, echoes of Guadalcanal can be traced in how Japanese commanders planned and in how the Imperial General Staff allocated resources. The island campaigns that followed often reflected a tension. Moments of audacious offensive planning were tempered, more frequently than before 1942, by an awareness that sustained success required more than bravery. At the same time, Japan's ability to translate this hard-won perception into effective structural reforms, better supply chains, greater air cover, sustained naval protection, was limited by resources and by the strategic situation. Recognition does not equate to capacity. Knowing that one needs more logistics is not the same as having the material or secure sea lines to provide it. For American military thought, Guadalcanal validated certain doctrinal bets made in the interwar period. The Marines' emphasis on small unit initiative, on combined arms preparations for likely defensive sectors, and on rigorous amphibious training paid dividends when the island's reality necessitated improvisation and toughness.
The campaign also reinforced a broader Allied understanding that the Pacific War would be decided not just by naval spectacle or single decisive engagements, but by grinding, industrially intensive contests over logistics and supply, a fact Japan could not ultimately match. When we return to the central question, what did Japanese commanders really think about U.S. Marines, and how did Guadalcanal change that thinking? We can offer a concise synthesis grounded in the sequence of events. Before Guadalcanal, many imperial officers, reinforced by a string of spectacular early victories and by cultural assumptions expressed in concepts like Yamato Damashi, genuinely believed that American forces could be broken by daring, moral weight, and aggressive maneuver. Guadalcanal forced a painful revision. The actions at Tenaru/Alligator Creek exposed the vulnerability of undisciplined night assaults against prepared defensive fires. Kawaguchi's attempt to turn the perimeter revealed the unglamorous but decisive truths of logistics and endurance in jungle warfare. The October offensive showed that massed assaults without sustained supply, air cover, and adaptable command would cost more than they gained. Over the course of weeks and months, Japanese commanders moved from a posture of confidence in moral primacy to a grudging respect for American tactical competence and industrial resilience. That cognitive shift mattered because it aligned Japanese strategic choices more closely with the harsh arithmetic of power. Attrition favored the United States. But alignment of perception and reality was, for Japan, belated and costly. The island forced not an instantaneous conversion, but a painful learning curve, one paid for in lives and in the gradual erosion of Japan's capacity to wage a war of attrition at scale. In the end,
Guadalcanal stands as a mirror reflecting both the limits of doctrine and the stubbornness of institutional beliefs. It is a case study in how cultural narratives about martial virtues can blind even experienced commanders to logistical and tactical realities. It is also a study in adaptation. The Marines learned quickly, improvised under fire, and translated training into survival. Japanese officers learned, sometimes too late, that courage without supply is brittle. Both sides paid dearly. As we remember these events, the human dimension must remain primary. The island's beaches and ridges hold the names of those who fought and those who fell, not merely as statistics, but as people who were part of systems, beliefs, and decisions, some brilliant, some tragically mistaken. Respectful remembrance does not simplify or moralize, it honors complexity and loss. If this history moved you, like and subscribe, and tell us where you're watching from.